As we were having our meditation, I was reflecting on how deeply infused it is in the Indian culture when I'm there, this deep infusion, that tranquility and awakening and connection to God or the divine, a sense of the oneness of it all. It's infused in every aspect of life as I walk about the society there. And I've had the blessing to be in India 10 or more times by this time in my life here. So we will begin with a meditation. Please take a comfortable seat and rest your hands in your lap if you like. Or sometimes it's very nice to put a hand on the heart and maybe a hand also on the belly. As we're coming into our Dharma time tonight, I would encourage you to offer yourself a welcome, a warm welcome, and also a gentle prayer. And that prayer can be, may I be free from unnecessary pain. May I be kept safe from unnecessary harm. May I be free from unnecessary suffering. May I be at ease. May I be at peace. You can use that as a gentle echo into your body and your heart. So, of course, you say it to yourself with the pronouns that you prefer. For example, may I be at peace. You may say to yourself in whatever way that's meaningful. May you be free from unnecessary pain. May you be kept safe from harm. May you be free from unnecessary suffering. May you be at ease. May you be at peace. We'll welcome this phrase to repeat in your own heart, or even one of the phrases. May you be free from unnecessary pain. May you be kept safe from harm. May you be free from unnecessary suffering. May you be at ease. May you be at peace. Notice how it is to wish yourself well, to be generous with yourself in this way. And then you can add to these phrases whatever way you want to speak it to yourself. So I'm only giving an example. May I be free from unnecessary pain. May I and all beings everywhere be free from unnecessary pain. May I be kept safe from harm. May I and all beings everywhere be kept safe from harm. May I be free from unnecessary suffering. May I and all beings everywhere be free from unnecessary suffering. May I and all beings everywhere, near and far, past, present, and future, may we be at ease. May we be at peace. As you find yourself holding you in your heart, and as well, all beings everywhere, notice the quality of mind or the feeling tone of your body when offering this prayer. And then you can bring your palms together in Anjali Mudra. And please gently bow your head to your heart if you like. Release your hands as you're ready to. Feel free to open your eyes. Well, the practice we started with, the opening meditation, is simply a variation on Mayatri or Metta meditation. Mayatri is the word in the Yoga Sutras, and Metta is the word in the language of the Buddha, which he spoke to the average citizen. He spoke to the street people, the lay people, in the language of Pali. So in that language, a loving kindness meditation is called metta, or friendliness, loving friendliness. And in the sutras, it is Mayatri. So as we were having our meditation, I was reflecting on how deeply infused it is in the Indian culture when I'm there, this deep infusion that tranquility and awakening and connection to God or the divine, a sense of the oneness of it all. It's infused in every aspect of life as I walk about the society there. And I've had the blessing to be in India 10 or more times by this time in my life here. And so when I say it's infused and you see it everywhere, it is a part of the culture, it's a part of the understanding, it's a part of what people are seeking. And it's also represented in many different rituals and practices, meditations, chanting, arti, which is a celebration at the changing of the light in the morning and in the evening. And you'll see a certain way that the arti is expressed, and the connection to the elements, to the 5 elements, to the practice of purification. And purification in this case means that we're purifying ourselves so that we're not crowded by the, may I call it, the mayhem or the mishmash of the mind. And we might experience the divine. You hear it in the music, you hear it in the kinds of ragas that are put together, the way the scales work. The ragas may have certain meanings, like the longing for the full moon on the water in the nighttime. There's a raga for that, right? Or the raga for the sunrise after the rains have ended. You know, it's like it's very connected to nature and to the divine and to this constant commitment to and belief in our ability to wake up, to awaken. And of course, even society there is extremely busy, overcrowded, quite noisy, a lot of turmoil and tumult. It's heavily conditioned and influenced by many other cultures now. And so you can feel it in the walking about of the society. And you can also feel that there's stress and tension and hustle and bustle, and there's constant horn honking, for example. And because people are now, they're driving not just rickshaws, they have tuk-tuks and they have motorcycles and things that honk. They have large trucks and cars. So it can be a very noisy and incredibly busy place. And yet you never sense that this divine leaves. In all that noise and haste, the divine does not evaporate. It is still there. And it's thousands of years of that kind of seeking and belief and commitment, and the texts that come from yoga, the ancient texts that are there, the Yoga Sutras, of which we know the Sutras of Patanjali as probably our most familiar, but there are other versions of that as well. And then the Upanishads, and also the Bhagavad Gita, of course, is ancient as well. So that's a thousands of years old society, and you can see and feel the many layers of this belief, this commitment in we can awaken to consciousness. And then you can see the infusion of a few hundred years of really heavy conditioning, and heavy conditioning meaning how the Western world and the industrialized societies are influencing India, and so in some ways not for the better. Let's contrast that with our culture, the dominant culture of the global north here in North America. So I think everyone who's here is from a part of North America tonight. So our dominant culture, and I'm calling it our dominant culture because the dominant culture that I'm a part of and that most of you have had some connection with or are a part of, took over another timeless community here, a native population that was here. So we colonized this place, and the dominant culture has only a few hundred years of society. It's just a few hundred years old. And in that way, it's very immature. It's a very young society. And it wasn't based on a deep spiritual tradition. So here we are in this society that we've grown up in. And what are we mostly conditioned towards? Post-industrialized society. We're conditioned to an economic mindset and a work mindset, and a heavily oriented to pull up your own bootstraps, a very individualized mindset. We're not oriented to a tribal mindset or a deeply spiritual mindset. We have a whole other kind of conditioning. And essentially we were born into that, those of us who were born into the dominant culture of the global north at this time in our lives. And I recognize that some of you may have been born into a more native family, and so I'm not speaking directly to your experience there. However, there might be the pain of how that native tradition has gotten overwhelmed by this dominant culture coming in. Well, one of the big dilemmas with this is that I think humans are born seeking some kind of meaning, some sort of dharma or purpose or understanding of life and the cosmos and the mysteries of what this is. And we have a phrase that I've been hearing since I was, in middle school. Like, I have existential angst as a middle schooler, as a high schooler. We had existential angst. I mean, we're just teenagers. We're having existential angst. What is it all about? My goodness, where are we going? Why are we here? And this phrase seemed very poetic at the time. When I think about it, the existential angst is actually quite painful to see how pervasive it is in our society. And I wonder if it's because of the separation from the sense of the collective divine, the separation from the greater whole of humanity and the ecology and the plants and nature, and seasons and everything. That we see it in the world around us. When we see more clearly after a yoga practice or a meditation practice, our senses light up to it. But otherwise, this society was built on a disconnection from those things. And again, I'm referring to the society that most of us have our, as my friend Faraji would call it, our colonized minds. Our minds have been colonized by this society. So it's very hard to have a tranquil mind in that conditioning. In fact, I would not recommend that we try to have a tranquil mind with that conditioning, but in spite of it, that we have a tranquil mind larger than that conditioning, that we aren't thinking, how can I reorganize this conditioning and find a way to have it be tranquil? It's the wrong conditioning for our evolution. And that's very evident in the climate collapse that we're facing. This is the wrong conditioning for our evolution as an individual and also for our evolution as a global society. So given that, the tranquil mind that I want to speak about tonight is connected to this history of yoga and not to life hacks in contemporary society in the dominant culture of the global north. Is that okay to proceed? You feel committed? So when I am in India and I have the joy of being there and I feel the sacred is infused in everything, it's even as simple as the way my Ayurveda doctor will greet me in the morning and his felt sense of the importance of tuning into his patients and being with us at the Ayurveda clinic. It's in the food that's delivered to your room there and the way that they're cooking only by original cooking systems on the appropriate flame in the appropriate way. And every piece of attention is given to that. So for me at the Ayurveda Center, it's deeply steeped in this. And I also feel it when we're in the arti and we're at the ashram and of course in the meditative practices with my teachers in Mysore or Rishikesh or Tiruvannamalai. And in the music of Varanasi when I go to see my teacher there, and in Chennai as well, my other teacher is there. And it doesn't leave you when you then walk out into the marketplace. And that is a key thing. It doesn't leave you as you walk out into the marketplace of India, because there is a marketplace life there now, as there is here, mostly marketplace and very little of the sacred and the divine. So I think a key thing is, why doesn't it leave us when we walk out into the marketplace? A second key thing is, if it does start to leave you, if it starts to wane, and the marketplace is flooding your senses, you have a deep pain, like the pain of that sacred leaving you, and you want to go back home to it. Sometimes that shows up in the form of, you're in the hotel, you go out to the marketplace, it's totally overwhelming, you have to go back to the hotel. You can't handle it anymore. You can't do one more horn honk or one more person trying to sell you a shawl. You can't see one more painful homeless person begging. So you go back to your hotel, you're looking for the place of refuge, and the hotel might be the refuge in that case if you're in the marketplace out there. Karen has been to India with me, so she knows what I'm talking about in terms of, you've got to get out of that marketplace sometimes and get back to your hotel in this case. So the marketplace and the indulgence in the marketplace, that is called boga. And the tranquility and the depth of study and the sense of unity with everything that is and all that has been and will be is called yoga. So there is boga and yoga. And my teacher in Mysore, he says, too much boga, much less yoga. He says, if you have more yoga, you want less boga. So boga means how we overindulge. We sink ourselves into the things that are going to give us temporary pleasures, fleeting. In fact, we call them ephemeral or finite. It's called the mrit. It's the finite. Mrit is M-R-I-T. It's the finite, shiny object that satisfies only so temporarily. So the boga is an indulgence in that to the point of imbalance in our body, our mind, our heart, our psyche. And because boga and those indulgences aren't really deeply satisfying, we need more of them. A little bit like they're talking about these days with dopamine, right? So you have some boga, then you want more boga, and then more boga yet again. So understanding human nature is wanting more of that. Once economies got designed that could give those kinds of satisfactions, In other words, a merchant culture or a marketplace culture. Once it was designed that we could get these temporary satisfactions, we began like having deep changes in our sense of our ability to be satisfied, changes in our ability to even feel tranquil or to feel contented. So the more stuff that we could have, the more experiences that we could have, the more hoarding we could do, the more we can hoard things like possessions, but also experiences and accomplishments and resumes. We can hoard in so many ways because we're now trying to fill up something that cannot be filled by those means. And sometimes we have a felt sense we're trying to fill up an emptiness. But that emptiness, if it weren't filled by boga, we would recognize this sacred quiet, the sacred longing. A sacred calling might come through us. And we may seek connection that is ultimately much more deeply satisfying. And we call this connection yoga, the sense of intimacy, unity, a felt sense of oneness, in which state we are neither suffering from raga nor dvesha. Raga is craving and dvesha is aversion. But if we have boga, if we have lots of boga, we will want raga. We'll have craving, clinging, wanting, desire, grasping. And if we have that, we will also have aversion, dvesha. We will have resistance. We will have difficulties. We will not want some things and we will want other things greatly. So that makes a cycle in the mind. For example, once you have a little bit of boga and you enjoy it, you have some happiness. The happiness is called sukha. So I'm having the sukha. I want more sukha. So once I have sukha and happiness, short-term happiness, ephemeral happiness, the happiness of mrit, which is finite. Oh, I'm wanting more of it. Now I have raga. Now I have craving. Now I have clinging. Now I have attachment. I'm wanting to hold on to these experiences and these things and also these people and my identity with this situation. So sukha leads to raga. And then when we can't get what we want, we aren't able to sustain it, we have some bit of suffering. And that's called dukkha. We don't want the suffering. We have aversion to suffering. That's called dvesha. So you have sukha, raga, dukkha, dvesha. Sukha, raga, dukkha, dvesha. They go in a cycle. They're sort of chasing each other. And that chase cannot lead to tranquility. It can't help cultivate a tranquil mind. Because that cycle is basically feeding itself. And we see it all over. And some days we feel really lucky we're the one getting some sukha. We feel really fortunate we're not having so much dukkha. Maybe you'll have a decade, so much sukha and very little dukkha, and then you feel really fortunate. Or it might even, lose touch with what it's like to suffer because you have only auspicious experiences. Those are called punya experiences, virtuous experiences. That's pretty rare. And if that's happening for someone because they have beneficial circumstances, my hope is that as they have those beneficial circumstances and they feel this generosity from life, the inclination then would be to go to service or seva, to have some act of karma yoga, or some generosity, some dana, to give that forward or to give it outwards to others. Because ultimately, even if you have very pleasant circumstances for a long time and like all your needs are getting met, there is the likelihood still of not feeling contented. Contentment is, by the way, santosha. The word for contentment is santosha. So the likelihood of not feeling contented by that is there because if it's happening for you, beneficial circumstances, but all around you, you actually see difficulties and suffering, you may not feel that connected to the oneness that is underlying your beneficial situation and somebody else's difficult situation. And so one way to reconnect to that oneness or that sense of interconnectedness is to volunteer or to serve or to give of whatever means you have to give. The practice of dana, which means in English donation or giving of what you have to others, the practice is actually to loosen our sense of holding on to what we have. It's to loosen our grip on what we own or what we possess. It is also an act of generosity to benefit the welfare of others. But it is not only that. So I want us to understand that it's the loosening of our hold on that which we have. And that is very powerfully able to bring us into connection with the greater whole. Whole as in WHOLE, just to be clear. And service or karma yoga or seva is also a way for us to feel that interconnectedness. However, it ought to be provided not as a service of hierarchy, where I am helping the less fortunate because I have identified myself as a privileged person and I've identified them as a less fortunate person. Certainly society does that. In my particular life, I have more privilege than many people do. And yet I'm certainly not on any high rung on a ladder of privilege in terms of my status in this society. However, I have just enough well-being and just enough vitality and just enough support and just enough resource that I have made I was born with this DNA. I've made a lifetime of service. That is one of my primary commitments, is service. Service. If there isn't some service to be offered, I'm generally not interested in embarking on what's being sold to me. So that service is best offered in what we call self unto self. That means there's not a hierarchy. There is not a me and a you, or an us and a them, but actually self to self. So we see each other as our very self. We see that quote unquote other as us, and we see them in ourselves too. So if there is someone who has experienced a lot of misfortune, maybe they have quite a bit of suffering in their life. And what's recommended in the Yoga Sutras is that we would come into an attitude of compassion, karuna, compassion for them. And that compassion expands our heart. And when the heart expands, so does our ability to see ourselves as easily as vulnerable or susceptible to the kind of suffering this person is experiencing, had we walked in their shoes, had we experienced the way that their development went, or the way their family or community or history or society had treated them. Had we walked in their shoes, we would likely have been as susceptible to their circumstances. So we see ourselves, we see our humanity in them, and we also see the divinity in them. And as such, there's a reflection. This person is a reflection of the divine and a reflection of human nature, and so too are we. So these are various ways where we can return to that sense of the interconnected oneness that yoga is pointing us to. And I've mostly mentioned right now some of the interpersonal methods, like the loving kindness meditation, or again called Maitri or Metta, or Dana, giving or generosity, and also Seva or service. I'm interested in these interpersonal ways to feel more interconnected, because I think it helps to tend to the hungry ghost or the restless mind. So the hungry ghost is that in us which is always seeking and is never satisfied. And the restless mind is one of the outcomes of the hungry ghost. The restless mind is always wanting something more, or it's reviewing what has happened. It might be judging the past and preoccupied with the future. It might practice a lot of rumination and perseveration, and then also fantasizing and daydreaming, and maybe apprehension or anticipation. And so the mind is bouncing around like something in a hot skillet, as we say. If I was from the South, I'd have a more fancy way of saying that, but I'm not. So as an individual, how do we then, in our own lives, create the possibilities of a tranquil mind? And yoga has several recommendations for practices or attitudes that you can cultivate. I'd like to mention a couple of them, but I think there's an overarching perspective that's even more important to understand. Where is that tranquil mind? So what I'm going to talk about now is a little bit in the realm of how you might adopt a practice to get to where I'm going to be speaking about in a few minutes. And these are offered to us in a rudimentary and very important way, a foundational way in the Yoga Sutras. So, when you first open up the Yoga Sutras as a book, you're not given these practices right away. And that's not because they're advanced. It's because they're foundational. But the Yoga Sutras begins with the view of that which you are. And then Patanjali, as he's talking us through it, is speaking to us in the second pada of the sutras. He's saying, oh, if you're having some difficulty and you had to keep reading this book to get here, now I'm going to give you some lessons on what to do. Because if you accomplish yoga by the first 3 sutras, if you felt it like, oh, you felt the absolute truth of what was spoken in Sutra 1.3, you didn't have to keep reading. But insofar as you kept reading, by the time you get to the second pada, he's saying, okay, you're still here and you need some instructions. And he opens up that second pada by saying, there's a pathway to realization. There's a pathway to freedom. It's called Kriya Yoga. And this pathway includes, Kriya means the 3 prongs that he chose from the yamas and niyamas, the 3 legs of the stool to apply to yourself. And one is tapas, and then svadhyaya, and ishvari pranidhana. So tapas is discipline. It means the discipline to hold yourself to the yoga and not to go out into the boga. Svadhyaya is how we study our own craving, raga, and how we get into the boga. We study ourselves, but we also study the texts of yoga. It's also referring to the textual, the scriptures, the books, the narratives, the metaphors, so we can understand the nature of the mind. So we're not only studying ourselves, right? It's not just journaling and self-help books, and it's not intended to be just contemporary self-help methodologies, but actually to really study the nature of the mind and to see yourself via meditation and observation and concentration. So if you see yourself, I'm sure this has happened to some of us, we have a beautiful experience of Shavasana after a lovely yoga asana practice. We're feeling so wonderful in Shavasana, like, oh, it's the peace, the harmony, the wholeness, beautiful. And then some thought comes like a certain candy bar or a person you need to talk to, or, oh, a plan you're going to make, or, oh, I'm going to clean that closet. Like some idea comes to you about what you're going to do with that. I thank you for nodding your heads. Something comes, you're in that blissful state, and then something proposes itself to you on what you can now do with that amazing vitality and oneness and harmony. And isn't that interesting? So yoga is recommending that we study that. We study the fact that that happens. Why do I then feel prompted to do something? At other times, something more auspicious might occur in your meditation or your shavasana, where you feel this sense of interconnectedness and your felt sense of humanity, including yourself, becomes much more intimate. And you realize, oh, I have some amends to make. I have some repairs to offer. I have some healthy remorse or healthy regret. It's time for me to do some kind of reparation about that. And that would be an important sacred rite, to do that reparation. And that could be with an individual that you may have caused harm to, or it could be on a larger scale, your sense of the reparations that humanity has to make, the dominant culture has to make towards those who've been overshadowed by and harmed by us, those of us who are part of the dominant culture. The reparation could be to yourself. Like, oh, yeah, I've been leading myself hither and thither. I really lost my way, and I think I need to make amends here with myself. At other times, you have this luminous experience of your shavasana or your meditation, and you realize, oh, I think I could forgive that person. I think I could forgive the one who's harmed me. Or I could forgive myself for being inadequate or flawed, just like any other human being. So sometimes the overarching feeling of forgiveness might come through to you. So in those luminous moments, I would recommend it's a chance to study human nature, to see how from that luminosity or contentment in shavasana, how does boga arise? How does raga come back? And watch it until it abates. See it for its ephemeral wave on the ocean. If something comes more towards repair or forgiveness, I say simmer with it, because it's leading you to a resolution of tension, either the tension in your own life with the feeling that you're carrying some remorse or regret. And by the way, it's important to me that I say healthy remorse and healthy regret. It's not guilt in this case, because guilt can be very paralyzing. People don't know what to do with guilt. If they can't identify the actual wrongdoing and they don't have a sense of that they could repair it, guilt can become more paralyzing. In the research literature about this, and I think some of you are in the mental health community, so you may have seen this research. But the research shows that when somebody goes to guilt, it doesn't lead to action because it's something that compounds a sense of shame in themselves. So unhealthy guilt can lead to shame, which is immobilizing. But a felt sense of healthy regret and healthy remorse is mobilizing. We feel like actually doing something about it. And if there's actual healthy guilt, we feel like taking the corrective action. We actually have the motivation to do it. So just to clarify that particular piece. So if you're able to consider those as sacred rites of resolving the tension in yourself, the tension of history, your own, and then longer root tendrils of history, or the tension between you and somebody else, or something that you're carrying. If you're carrying animosity, which is called dvesha, if you're carrying hatred, dvesha, if you're carrying resentment, if you're carrying anger, it's called krodha, it means anger. If you're carrying those kinds of things in you, you will not have so much a tranquil mind because your body is carrying the tension of these important areas that need some resolution or some compassion or kindness or insight, wisdom. So if that happens for you from Shavasana, that is beautiful. Now, so what Patanjali is recommending when he says, okay, so maybe you need some instruction if you haven't understood in the first few sutras what is yoga. So I'll give you some instructions. Here is tapas, svadhyaya, and then ishvadi pranidhana. So from the study of the self, ishvadi pranidhana is this quality of surrendering, giving it over to God, surrendering all of your actions back to the divine. And you can imagine that healthy reparation and healthy forgiveness leads to a quality of surrender. You feel more connected to the divine once again. Well, he doesn't leave it there. That's not the end of the second pada. That's only the first two. So then he says, by the way, there's 5 causes of suffering. Let me tell you what they are, and I'll outline them and why they're here and what they do to you. And the 5 kleshas, which comes from the root word that involves the word klishta. So the 5 kleshas are the result of the klishtas, and klishta means a deeply saturated or deeply colored thought, a deeply saturated lens through which you are seeing the world. Okay, so those lenses, if you picture yourself as a bright beam of light, if your original self is a bright, luminous moon in the night sky, or a bright beam of light, but in front of that beam of light is a purple filter and a green filter and a polka dotted filter and a striped filter and a red filter. By the time this experience of the light come through those filters, then we have this conditioned view. So we're only seeing now through our lenses, through our filters, which is what we call conditioning. And so Patanjali puts this in the Yoga Sutras as klishtas. how can we lessen the deep saturation of those lenses that are blocking our view? And he says we do this by reducing the saturation or reducing the colorings of the mind. And then he recommends the yamas, the niyamas, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So he recommends the 8 limbs of yoga at that point. So tonight I'd just like to touch on a couple of those yamas and niyamas because I'd like to ultimately go back to what he said at the first part of the sutras to help you understand what they're pointing to as our actual inner nature. So yamas are precepts or commitments that we make to live well with each other, to be in a healthy community with each other. So it's how I graciously want to be in the world and consider my impact on others. And I had the blessing of being in Bodh Gaya in 2000, must have been 2017. Yes, in 2017, I was in Bodh Gaya, which is in India. It's where the Buddha had his awakening. So around that awakening is a village called Bodh Gaya, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama was there. And he was teaching for natives, and then a small group of Westerners could also join. You had to make application online, and it was pretty rigorous. You had to get in the queue. You had to be there on the computer at the time to get in for the queue. And I had 20 students traveling with me. And we just found out about it like in November, and this is opening up for a December event. So you had to have every person's passport number, their mother's name, their father's name, and a picture of them ready to go in the queue. So I managed to get us all signed up for being with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And one of his primary focuses at that teaching, speaking to natives, and also many monks were there, many average citizens were there, many monks from different traditions were there. Many had made a long trip to come to Bodh Gaya. We had made a long trip too, but ours was mostly by airplane and then by vehicles. We hadn't made a pilgrimage on foot. And his primary teaching in 2017 was this. He said, live an other cherishing life. Live in such a way as you're cherishing the well-being of others. Now, I'm a Westerner, and so were my traveling students, Westerners, and they were like, what about self-care? We would have these talks at lunch. What about taking care of myself? What about my needs? What about me? So when I came home from that trip in India, I talked about it for many months, and of course, we spoke about it at the teachings. And this is how we came to understand. He was so insistent on this for 4 days that I thought it was very purposeful for him to choose to talk about it to the natives as well as to this small group of Westerners who were there. It seemed to me that he was talking at a time in society when human beings have lost their way in terms of considering the welfare of other people as their responsibility. And though I sense that we lost our way here in the dominant culture of the global North, we lost our way a long time ago, and we're told to look out for ourselves and pull up our bootstraps and look out for number one. And, it's caused a lot of suffering. You'll hear that when I tell you what the 5 kleshas are. It's also happening in other societies that the conditioning is changing their orientation. And so he was speaking to the locals there as, let's change our attention. And he said, live an other cherishing life. And then he added, if you live a self-cherishing life, you will be suffering. And so what he meant by that was, if you're only preoccupied with yourself and your own welfare, you'll be suffering. And again, in the Western minds that were there at the gathering, we're like, well, we were told to look out for ourselves. We're told to, look out for our well-being. So my hunch from his teachings, oh, that's great. Yeah. My hunch from his teachings is that he's talking about the design of the human species, because he's very interested in science and the sacred and the mystical tradition he comes from. So he's talking about our nature is to be more collaborative, to be more considerate of the welfare of others, to have in our hearts this desire for generosity. and service, to look out for everyone as our very self. And we've been conditioned away from that, so we're suffering, because now we have these lenses that tell us we have to look out for this or that about ourselves. And we live in a society, those of us in the dominant culture of the global north also live in a social construct that keeps producing that mindset. So backing up then, when he says live as an other cherishing life, that will also expand our hearts to be like, okay, how do I conduct myself today so that I'm reducing my propensity to cause harm, and I'm increasing my ability to create support, life, vitality, well-being. Here's an example. How do I reduce my footprint in terms of the ecological dilemma today? What choices will I make? What purchases will I make? How can I consider my impact on the greater whole? And how can I take care of someone or something or an aspect of the nature or the community around me today? How can I make a contribution today? What is that going to be? And just asking those questions when we feel into our morning meditation can give us some inspiration that we are connected to a greater rhythm. There is a greater ecology. There's a greater social dilemma going on. And somehow I want to be a part of that. I don't want to just be beholden to the ongoing conditioning that is always flooding in. It's like in the atmosphere of our culture here, whereas in the atmosphere of the culture in India, what I feel is the thousands of years of the sacred still available there. And because I'm connected to Native communities here in the Pacific Northwest, what I feel is their deep desire for their timeless tradition of the divine and the sacred to also be revived and to be shared, and certainly to be practiced and to be respected, and not to be squished out of the radar screen. So he says, then here's the yamas and niyamas. The yamas are first. Here's how you're going to take care of your community. If each one of you makes this commitment, your community will be very healthy. And so he starts with ahimsa, the practice of non-harming. And then he adds satya, the practice of truthfulness. And then aparigraha, which translates as non-hoarding, but it's been convenient here in the West to translate it as non-grasping. And then in Western yoga, we've translated that as non-grasping in asana. But the teaching is actually non-hoarding, not possessing so much, not hoarding stuff. And then he says, brahmacharya, live with a respectful relationship to the vitality of others. Respect their physical vitality, respect the boundaries of their body, respect their senses, respect the vitality of their senses. So don't be too noisy of a person, right? Don't be too invasive of a person. Live with respect for the dignity and the vitality of others. That's called brahmacharya. It's often translated as celibacy, which is one of his recommendations if you're going to be a sannyasin or a sadhaka. You're going to be a student alone, but I think you're householder yogis, those of you who are here. And then he says, in living in this society with others, so ahimsa, satya, aparigraha, brahmacharya. I'm having amnesia. What is the fifth one? Somebody will have to remind me. Maybe asteya. Sorry, it's not fifth. I got my order confused, but you guys, I have a brain injury, so this is what it's like sometimes, little detours. So asteya means non-stealing, non-stealing. So in this case, what you're really looking at is the classical translation would be, don't take that which does not belong to you. And even more classical translation is not taking that which hasn't been given to you. So another way of giving respect and supporting the greater good. And I'm not taking that which hasn't been given to me. And of course, we have a history on this continent that we live in, those we're here from North America, of taking over a land that wasn't given to us. And when I was in India, I was there during Thanksgiving, and I all the American stuff coming through my email or other access that I have was celebrating Thanksgiving. And I was talking to my Indian teachers and my Ayurveda doctors, like, I don't celebrate Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is a day of mourning. It's a day of horrific history in our culture. And having that I was in India, where they had also been colonized and taken over, I could also feel the pain that is a part of that history in their society, and that deep pain in our society. So not taking that which hasn't been given to us is both our personal commitment, and then also, what do I do to participate in acknowledging and helping with reparations beyond that? How do I participate? So now you think you have a long list of things to do to get to a tranquil mind, but please don't worry, because I'm going to give you a simple inroad in a short bit here. After the yamas, he says, okay, also you can try on these niyamas. These are very important as well. Now this is how you practice with yourself. How are you in relationship with yourself? And it begins with saucha, with cleanliness. And that means cleanliness of the mind and the body. So your routine, your food choices, not just cleanliness like bathing, but how do we keep care of the inner body too? I've taught yoga in prison for 25 years, maybe more than that now, 26 years. And frequently I'm talking with students about what to do with food when they live in the facility. What kind of choices can you make on a food line that doesn't really have nutrition? What can you do with the food that's being provided to you? And so we do talk about how to keep saucha when you live in that kind of facility where the food's kind of toxic. In fact, it's very low grade, very low in nutrition. So what do you do? That's a different Dharma talk for a different time, because I have to watch the clock. Otherwise, we'll be here till midnight. And then those who live in other time zones will have passed out by that time. So then he says, okay, after saucha, let's practice santosha, which is contentment. The contentment of, I have enough. Can I be content with things as they are? Can I take a seat in meditation and just be content, so I don't have to wrestle with my hair, my shawl, my cloth? You know, there's a poem that Ram Dass loved to quote. I think some of you study with Ram Dass. It's a poem by Kabir when he's talking about, you know, you think you have this anger all settled, but there you are wearing this kind of robe, and you get annoyed with the texture of the robe. You think you've gotten this worked out. Why don't you wear a burlap sack? Because then, you know, you can really feel what it's like to have your skin getting rubbed. There's a whole discussion that Ram Dass would give about this experience of, can we just be contented to have whatever we have? We don't need silk robes. We might have a burlap sack. So this is, santosha means contentment. And then he says the next three, tapas, svadhyaya, ishvadi pranidhana. And those are the three-legged stool of Kriya Yoga as well. So this is his response here to give us the 8 limbs of yoga, is a response to how are we going to navigate the deep saturation of conditioning in our minds that causes the kleshas, the causes of suffering. And I'll tell you what they are, and you can feel how these things, they block your ability to have a tranquil mind. And then I'll go back to the beginning of the sutras where you can learn how to have a tranquil mind. The first cause of suffering is avidya, and it means the absence of knowing yourself. Not knowing ourselves deeply, the deeper essence of that which we are. It is also the experience of having others not know that in you. So the experience of not being known. Or for example, only being known for something you've done, whether wonderful or painful. Or only being known inaccurately. Somebody misreads you. They only interpret you inaccurately. That's very painful. Broken mirroring is what I call that. When we get broken mirroring, it's very painful. So avidya means that we've lost our deepest knowing. Vidya is wisdom. Avidya is the absence of that knowing. The second cause of suffering is asmita, the feeling of separateness. And that's what His Holiness was talking to when he said, live an other cherishing life. This feeling of separateness causes so much pain. And those two kleshas give rise to the next 3 kleshas, which are raga and dvesha. I've spoken already tonight about those. And then abhinivesha. So raga, dvesha, abhinivesha. And abhinivesha means fear, the fear of not going on being. Fear of not being understood, with the fear of disconnecting from ourselves in a way that we don't know how to get back, right? So this sort of fear that pervades the human species when we aren't able to be really connected. So those are the 5 causes of suffering. And each one of them prevents us from having a tranquil mind. So in a way, Patanjali is recommending some very pragmatic things, like let's do less harm. Let's be more truthful. Let's not take that which doesn't belong to us. Let's respect the well-being of others and help them to uphold that too. And let's not hoard. Let's not hold on to stuff. And let's practice cleanliness and contentment and self-discipline and self-study and surrender. He's giving some very pragmatic things to do, but it's very hard to apply those when we're in the social conditioning that most of us have been overexposed to. So what do we do to then have this tranquil mind? So yoga has more than one path, and one way is let's reduce the tension of not knowing ourselves. We can do that with yoga asana and pranayama and moving the physical body so that we can reduce the tension of the harm that we have carried, and also reduce the tension of not really knowing ourselves deeply. Another option is let's increase our elegance in pranayama, in meditation. Let's increase the good qualities in us, those compassion, as I said before, and loving kindness. But there's a third option here, and it is to understand the nature of the self. And with that understanding, then we naturally want to reduce the tension that keeps us getting lost. And we naturally want to increase our vitality to stay in harmony with that. So it's a little bit like if somebody was going to decide to go on a diet because they want to increase their health and well-being. And let's say that their only focus is on what foods they cannot eat and what foods they must eat to make this happen. But they didn't have any real focus or relationship with vitality, with the actual substance of vitality. So they may have a list of foods not to eat and a list of things to do, and they may go about that mechanically, and then likely they will suffer a bit or feel constrained. So if they don't have a relationship with vitality, with the radiance that's going to come through them, it's hard to stay motivated. By the way, there's a word for that radiance too. It's tejas, T-E-J-A-S-E, tejas. So what I'd like to do is a short meditation, and I'm going to chant to you the first 3 sutras so you can hear them. But we'll have a little meditation time, and my intention is that with everything that you've just heard, you can let that sit around you as the ancient texts of yoga, thousands of years of wisdom and discovery that's available to us. And let's imagine that our ancestor yogis, they did not get to states of deep understanding by mentally figuring it out first. They came to states of deep understanding, and then they went back and wrote it down for us. They wrote it down for thousands of years of people to benefit from this. But I don't think they hammered their way into understanding and were writing it down along the way. My sense is they understood very deeply as a result of practices. And then lo and behold, they decided to write it down, or to have an oral tradition. At first it was spoken, it was a spoken tradition, and then it got written down, but it got codified because of their awakening. It wasn't that codifying it awakened them. Do you understand what I'm saying? So I'm recommending that it's not greater mental effort to get where we're going. When we get there, we will see all this makes sense from the inside. So please take a comfortable seat and rest your hands in your lap. And close your eyes. If it's helpful, you could put your hands, sometimes it's nice to cross the hands and put one on each side of the heart. Or some people do like to put one hand on top of the other on the heart. So whatever is comfortable for you. And as you sit, I'm going to invite you to imagine a body of water, like a lake or a pond. And imagine this lake becoming more and more still. So you're watching it become more reflective. And let everything that I've said so far in Dharma, let that all fade into the background and only observe the water on the surface of the lake in your imagination, getting more still. You might even imagine yourself sitting by this lake, watching it get still. As you observe the water becoming more still, start to imagine the reflections that you'll see in the water. Maybe the trees overhead are mirrored on the surface of the water. Maybe you'll see the open sky on the surface of the water. Notice that in looking at the water, you're allowing it to become still. You're not creating that, and you're not interrupting it. And you could imagine on this water the reflection of birds passing overhead in the sky. And though you see those birds on the water surface, they make no ripples. And notice that again, the water can be clear, like a mirror. And even if a cloud passes overhead, the water is not dented by the cloud. An airplane might come with a loud noise, and the water is not disturbed. The trees might sway on a high breeze. And even if gentle ripples come from the wind, the water then settles back down. It once again can become reflective. Now let's imagine this same body of water begins to have little droplets of rain in the form of our thoughts, little droplets of rain, just a few. Each little raindrop creates a ripple, a little circle of ripples. You can imagine the raindrops increasing, and notice when the surface of the water starts to become distorted. And as the raindrops increase in weight and frequency and in number, soon we will not see the clear surface of the water. And yet we will know that that surface can become still once again. So practice seeing the rain and not forgetting the nature of water to be reflective. The practice of not forgetting. Imagine the rain is there, but the mind observing the water is undisturbed and has not forgotten the nature of the water as a mirror. As you sit by the water, seeing the rain, but knowing the water has a capacity to reflect once again, now start imagining that the raindrops become a little bit fewer and a little bit less heavy and a little less frequent. Allow yourself to imagine that going down in volume slowly, slowly until you see just a couple of droplets once again. Meanwhile, your mind did not become concerned about the water's ability to come back to reflection. And so you are arriving back in a seat that you have not left. As you gaze on the reflection, you might see now the moon on the surface of the water, or the light of the moon, the darkness of the trees. the smoothness of the water. Reflecting each thing without conditions, with equal regard. Atta yoga nusasanam. Atta yoga nusasanam. Yogas chitta vritti nirodha. Yogas chitta vritti nirodha. Tada drastu svarupe vastanam. Tada drastu svarupe vastanam. So now the yoga begins. Yoga is experienced when the fluctuations of the mind have quieted down. And then we are resting in our inner nature. We are established in the inner witness, in the inner loving presence. Tada drastu svarupe vastanam. Tada drastu svarupe vastanam. So coming to know this inner svarupe, the form of the self, through the experience of the seer, drastu, we then experience yoga, or a tranquil enough mind that we can feel the intimate oneness. If you like, you can raise your hands to your heart as a way to close your meditation. You're welcome to bow your head to your heart if you appreciate that gesture. And in your own timing, you're also welcome to open your eyes and release your hands. I'm sorry that I have very poor lighting in my space. I don't have any lights turned on, and now it's gotten dark. But I can still see you, and you can see there's a part of me here. So I would be honored to know your experience in meditation here and any questions or insights that came to you. You're welcome to unmute and just offer that.
Thank you, Sarah Joy. That was beautiful. I found it transporting. It took me back to India, just the language, the sound, and it was interesting during the meditation you were talking about the moonlight on the water, but that's kind of how I had started. When you were talking about the clear sky and the reflection and the birds, I thought of like white swans in the moonlight on the water, like on a lake or something. And then I thought of it on Gangama. So it was beautiful. And I've got a little bit of a background noise, shall we say. I'm in a house with a couple of women right now. So it was nice to have even like that little challenge, just to like have that
Yeah,
to tap into anchoring in some ways, even more so than if I'd just been here in silence. So thank you. Really beautiful.
yeah, that's an interesting observation you're making there because, Amanda, we could have a perfectly tranquil environment and then have a perfectly beautiful meditation, quote unquote, perfectly. But actually having some noise in your home, as you were saying, being able to sustain that through the raindrops getting more intense, right?
Mm.
Um, sustaining in the marketplace of life that which we know, like really specifically not forgetting that the water is capable of being a mirror. In this case, that's the metaphor. Not forgetting the nature of our minds. They're capable of tranquility, stable tranquility. The word is stitao. Um, and also not forgetting them when we see somebody else, let's say in life, where they're making a lot of noise or their life is very noisy. Let me use that word for now. It means it's painful, it's very conditioned. They're a person that has a pain body, to use Eckhart Tolle's phrase. We don't want to forget that they have the potential to also, they are also this water. They are also that.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome. Are there one or two others who might be able to share your experience?
I really sensed into contentment and a quality within myself and in my body of non-grasping and really being with what is without need for interference.
Mm-hmm. It's beautiful when if we can come to that place that you're describing, and again, sorry that you can't see me. Let's imagine then you're there reflecting on the water, and one of your painful behaviors comes to visit. And we can look at it with this quality of mind and sincerity to understand, why do I come to this painful behavior? Why am I mired in this? What do I know about it? What can I learn about it? If we don't get all ruffled in a thunderstorm, we have the chance to learn something in that space.
Mm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would be honored to hear. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
I grew up in my house that we recently had to sell. It was across from a lake. Spent a lot of time at the lake and watching the lake and the water. And I found that the raindrops weren't quite enough. I needed wind because I needed white caps. And I really loved working with their swans that would come around to the lake fairly frequently. And I really liked playing with just a wing dipping into the lake and the what that does to the water, the indent on the water and the birds landing and frogs jumping. There was a lot of sound. There was a lot of sound for me at the lake. And at first I was watching the lake. I was sitting on the shore and watching the lake, but eventually I actually like the lake and my mind kind of leveled off to being in the same kind of zone. And I wasn't so much a witness of the lake. I was more, again, the lake and my mind were in the same plane. It was really quite lovely, quite lovely. Yeah.
What a cool experience you had. Yeah, and you were drawing on memory, which is totally fine. Memory. And so really sensing that the whole time the lake didn't mind. If there was a swan, if there was a bird, if there was a frog, the lake doesn't mind. Goes on being its lake self. It is being its
Yeah.
lake-like self. And what
And there
happens?
can even be in playfulness in the
Yeah,
indents. The indents, not all the disruption is unwanted or unwelcome or not beautiful.
right.
Some,
Right.
some of the disturbance is the beauty of the wing that just touches and then moves on. Uh,
Yeah. And
yeah.
so the key thing in yoga is that we haven't lost sight of the nature of the water. We aren't losing sight of the nature of our consciousness. So even if we get into the display of all the things and all the variations, we haven't lost sight of the nature of consciousness. We aren't far from home. We aren't getting confused about that. So what Patanjali says in the next Yoga Sutra, he says, now the yoga practice and the yoga discussion is going to begin. Now we're underway. Atta yoga nusasanam. And then he says, let me tell you what yoga is. Yogas chitta vritti nirodha. And then he says, when you're experiencing yoga, tada drastu svarupe vastanam. Yoga is the experience that we have as the seer. We know our true self. And then he says in the next sutra, at all other times, you're getting confused. Basically, at all other times, if we confuse the experiences that we're having as us, and we forget the nature, the svarupe, the nature of who we are most deeply, then we're losing out on really knowing what is the nature of water, even if it's a waterfall, if it's a bucket, if it's an ice cube, if it's a rainy day, if it's a lake, if it's an ocean. What is the nature of water? It is not being forgotten. But we so often forget our deepest indwelling nature as our species. We have forgotten. And then we forget that in others too. That's what causes us to harm others as well, or to dehumanize them. So just a reminder that what Heidi's describing is a beautiful way to experience the meditation. And I would be remiss as your yoga teacher not to point out just this one really important gem, that in yoga, we are not forgetting the nature of the water. We have not forgotten the nature of consciousness. Even if our life is getting tumultuous, we don't forget the nature of consciousness. And we may not have a solid grasp on that right now because we're working through some painful stuff or some conditioning, some busyness of mind. So we carve out the time to watch the raindrops settle. And then you can actually practice creating raindrops in your mind during meditation, and then actually let them settle. Watch yourself go back to settling. And in the time that it's settling back, you have not, this is my recommendation, that we don't forget that it's water. The water is still there the whole time. The water still has the capacity to be a mirror, even though I'm disturbed right now with my raindrops. It's wonderful to have a quality of equanimity in whatever is happening with the water, and then this non-forgetting. This is the non-forgetting, remembering that the water has this quality to it. So if avidya, the first cause of suffering, is forgetting your deepest nature or forgetting the deepest wisdom, then vidya is that wisdom. So the solution to avidya is not forgetting. And we could say that is remembering our innate wholeness or our innate worthiness, our innate conscious being that we are. Okay, thank you. I'd like to close with a prayer that says, Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. And loka means everyone in the world, everyone equally, without any exclusion. Loka sukhino, can everyone have ease? Bhavantu, in the attitude, can they have ease in their hearts? You can raise your hands if you like. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm honored that we get to come together. Thank you for sharing your time, your vitality, your attention, and your intentions with me and with the community. Namaste.